Welcome to the More Than Fitness podcast.
Hello, podcast friends, and welcome back to Minisode number 85 on the More Than Fitness podcast. As the people on the video podcast can see on YouTube, I am back in my parents' basement. I am here currently to be the best man at my best friend's wedding this weekend, and so I am back from New York City, and I am in Kentucky at my parents' house, and I also have the handheld mic, so I feel like a newscaster because I don't have my stand and all that kind of good stuff. But nonetheless, no matter where I'm located, I will always make sure to bring you guys some piping hot fire on this minisode. I don't know where that phrase came from, but today's minisode is going to be easy carb cycling for a better body. So I'm going to have a little bit of a different take on this than a lot of people who chat about carb cycling or spout their proposed benefits. But most people see carb cycling as a way to promote muscle growth with higher carb days. For example, on training days, whenever you work out, you have a higher carb day that promotes muscle gain. And then on rest days, and whenever you don't work out, you're going to have lower carb days. And they say that this is going to promote more fat loss on lower carb days. So higher carb days is to stimulate muscle growth, and then lower carb days promote fat loss. Based off the research and scientific literature that I've seen, that just simply is not the case. Whenever they test these out, the differences between differing calorie amounts, different fat and carbohydrate amounts, it simply does not matter whenever it comes to fat loss. You can have high carb days and low carb days, but the main thing that is dictating fat loss and weight loss is your total calories for the day. All right. So I think that real quick, before I give you a system for carb cycling, I have to lay out some of the flaws that I see with it. And then I'll give you a system that's kind of modified. Right. So the first couple flaws is that the body is not an on and off switch whenever it comes to these physiological changes. And so whenever people say, oh, you should just have a high carb day whenever you train and a low carb day whenever you don't train, and then that'll promote fat loss. Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. For our bodies to adapt, it takes more than just a quick transient change, at least whenever it comes to body composition, right? It needs a little bit longer to adapt any certain way than just low carb one day, high carb another day. It's too transient of a period, right? So physiologically, it doesn't necessarily work, and the research just doesn't back it up as far as having any more benefit than just managing your calories, right? The second flaw is going to be if you have a low carb day and then a hard training session the next day, right? So let's say you have a low carb day on Monday, and then Tuesday morning, you're supposed to go in for a workout. Well, you're not going to have the glycogen in your muscles to fuel that workout session in the morning because you had a whole low carb day the day before that, right? So again, our bodies are not these on and off switches, right? And so even if you have a breakfast, a pretty carb heavy breakfast, it's not going to be readily available to use, at least in your muscles and things, in that morning workout session. It needs a little bit more time for that to have some glycogen resynthesis. I think it typically takes about 24 hours for that to happen. So whenever you have a low carb day and then a hard workout session the next morning, that low carb session could suffer, right? Your performance may not be the best. And then lastly, the last flaw I see is that you're going to have a variety of different meals to choose from based on the day, because you're going to have different meals if it's a high carb day versus a low carb day, right? And so for some people, this may be great. You know, they have lots of variety. They can eat different food choices, different varieties of food, different sources. Yeah. But for other people who are really busy and their brain doesn't work that way, they need a consistent meal schedule so they don't have to think a whole lot about it, about the choices that they have. They'll eat the same thing, Monday through Friday with no problem. So for them, cycling may be a little bit more difficult. Now, there's not likely a magical fat burning effect from carb cycling, but I think what carb cycling can be helpful for is it gives people rules, and people sometimes respond well to rules. And so what it could help with is staying consistent without being overly anal about tracking your calories or your macros, or just overthinking too much, right? It's easy for people and simple to be like, hey, on the days you work out, you're going to have carbs. On the days you don't work out, you're not going to have carbs, right? Like that's the main gist of how it goes. And so for most people, that's going to balance out calories, right? Because if you're having low carb, high fat, high protein, well, you're missing an entire macronutrient there, basically, that is going to regularly add calories. But since you're doing the carb cycling, you don't get in those additional calories. And the same thing goes for a high carb day, because if you're going to have a high carb day, you should also probably have it low fat. And so that in itself balances things out. They kind of counterbalance each other, and you end up eating not a shit ton of calories. And so if you want to participate in carb cycling and see if this works for you, because it very much might work for you, what you would do is, and the way that I would modify it is so first I'll talk about having high carb days on training days. So days that you lift weights, I would have higher carb, lower fat. I think lower fat is the key here. So your carb sources should be foods like white or sweet potatoes. You should have oatmeal, whole wheat pasta and tortillas, fruit, whole grain bread, quinoa, rice, right? All of these options are very nutrient dense and low fat options. You can't be getting your carb sources from high fat sources like pizza or ice cream or cakes or donuts or muffins, right? Because then you're just trying to have an excuse to eat like shit. The key here with the high carb days is making sure, one, that you resistance train, you do lift weights and you have a hard session. And then two, making sure that you go high carb, but then you also go low fat. And of course, the constant in all of this is making sure that you have moderate to high-ish protein sources to go along with it, right? And so on the low carb days, I would put a lower carb days on your rest days, and then also days that you might do interval training or conditioning or cardio or something like that. So on these days, you would have to go low carb and then moderate to high fat and protein. Again, the protein is going to stay constant here, and that is crucial. And whenever I say low carb days, I don't think you have to worry, because we're not trying to get into ketosis or anything like that. So you don't have to be super anal about that. Would be kind of defeat the purpose of why you're trying to do the carb cyclings, because it's easy, right? But with ketosis, you have to measure things. You have to make sure you're under a certain amount, right? It's way too much work for little to probably no benefit at all, actually. And that's a topic for another day. But the meal sources on low carb days would be a fatty protein source and vegetables. So meals like a mixed vegetable omelet would be great. So eggs and vegetables. Steak and asparagus would be another one, or like a grilled chicken salad with olive oil as the dressing would also be great. And my one modification to this, and what I mentioned earlier about if you have morning workout sessions, if you do have a morning workout on Tuesday, for example, I would say on Monday night, I would make sure to have a pretty high carb meal. Even if you went all of Monday and you went low carb, I would have a high carb meal before bed. And then if you could possibly, whenever you wake up in the morning, have another small to moderate. It depends on when you work out. You could even have a large carbohydrate meal then too, but then you've got enough carbohydrates in you for a long enough period where you could probably see the glycogen benefits. It could fuel your training a little bit, and you could still get all the benefits that you're looking for with the carb cycling. So that would be my one modification with that. And that's mostly it, honestly. Like that's about as complicated as it's going to get. I think the one last thing that people can do if they don't want to do this on a daily basis, you can actually, and I talk about this in my Automated Fitness 2.0 product, which I will put in the description. I'll go ahead and put a link there if you're curious. This is one of the ways that I tell people they can make progress without tracking calories or counting macros. And so instead of rotating days with higher carb days and lower carb days, right? Instead, you would go meal to meal. So you would have, for example, you would rotate your carbs and fats for each meal. So with breakfast, it would maybe be lower carb, higher fat, higher protein. And then for lunch, it would be lower fat, higher carb, higher protein, right? And this just, instead of doing it on a daily basis, you do this on a meal to meal basis. And so for me, what that would look like is maybe breakfast, it would be high fat, high protein. And then lunch, or it'd be like my pre-workout meal, basically, that would be higher carb and higher protein, but lower fat. And then I would work out. And then afterwards, I would also have a higher carb, lower fat, higher protein meal. And then before bed, I would have a low fat, or I would have a high fat, low carb, high protein meal. Man, that is difficult without writing it down. But yeah, that's just another way you can do the carb cycling on a meal-to-meal basis as opposed to a daily basis. Again, the whole key here with all of this is just to find an approach to your nutrition that encourages you eating nutritious, high-protein foods and also staying consistent, right? Just making sure that you can do this on a consistent basis without hating yourself, right? Encourage healthy foods and then also make sure that you can do it long term, right? So something to play around with, some ideas to consider. And that is it for Minisode number 85, easy carb cycling for a better body. And that is it. Thank you as always for listening and for watching. See ya.